Yeah.
Patrick, I've been with Greg in a couple of moments on presidential campaigns. One of them is one of the big four deadly quotes, right? John McCain saying, the fundamentals of the economy are strong as Lehman Brothers collapsing in 2008, right? A memorable moment in that campaign. When you look at Kamala Harris saying on The View, not a thing, when the president's approval level is what it is, and you have a right track number of 28%, why isn't not a thing uh, going to end up on the list of what I call the killer asteroid quotes of I voted for it before I voted against it. Uh, the 47% quote by Romney, the one I just mentioned by McCain, that specifically are at odds with the electricity of the electorate in a vital moment. When Greg talks about the election being about change, and it being about change from both the Trump and the Biden years. I'm going to be ask you to react to something specifically. I think it's broader than that, right? I think the change is about the Bush years. I think it's less so about the Obama years, right? I think you can sculpt out the 8 years of Obama. I think the country would take them back in a substantial number. But the Bush years, the war in Iraq, the war years, Biden, Trump, the 10 years of Trump, I think that's what she has to capture in order to do it. But I'm curious your reaction to all of that.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that. I certainly don't envy Harris's position, where she's a member of this administration. She obviously, for beyond campaign reasons, but as a leader in the United States government, does not want to be undermining confidence in the president for whom she serves. And yet, we all know that the excitement around Harris was the fact that she represented change from Biden as much as Trump. She literally replaced Biden, and at that moment, people became excited about voting for her. So I think it's a tricky position to be in. I do think that, I think in general, this is obviously not my position as someone who, was part of doing communication strategy for the Obama White House, part of his White House polling team. I think that was a moment, and since Obama, where the Democratic Party did start to become a little bit more associated with elites. And I do think that is one piece where undecided voters and voters who've been trending away from the Democratic Party, there was some concern about that coming out of the Obama year. So I do think that there is a bigger desire for a more fundamental change in how our politics and elections work. And I think that has been Trump's appeal, in spite of what everyone knows about him, and in spite of their concern that this might not be someone who has the temperament to lead the country. But beyond that, I agree. I think that there is a significant change in terms of a desire for America's involvement in other countries, as opposed to America really focusing on itself and repairing problems that we have at home. And again, I think Trump has done a very good job at conveying that. That has been, again, part of his appeal to working class voters, including working class voters of color, that we have seen trend away from Democrats. I think Democrats have to get better at reaching those voters and demonstrating that we're really committed to a vision of the country that's fairer to them, and is rooted in the concerns that they have in their daily lives.
And Steve, I don't want to, dismiss like the ease of, kind of change from Biden and Trump for Harris, because I know you and I had many conversations about the need for McCain to distance himself from George W. Bush. And every time the White House got an inkling that that's what we're going to do, the amount of intense and institutional pressure coming back at us that we could never do that to the president kind of overwhelms you. And even if it's the right strategic thing to do, it's very difficult.
So I want to come back to that too, because I think it's elemental towards what she has to do to be able to win. And if she doesn't meet the test, she's not going to win. But come back, Greg. I cut you off on your first element, and I want you to talk about the second element before we got into the conversation about why it is that if people don't like the chaos, why they would pick a chaos agent in my view. But go ahead.
Well, I think it kind of factors more into the perception that Trump is stronger than she is as a leader. And so I think that is what really matters. But I think that there's, the second tier of how you can define change. What works for Trump is that the change on the immigration and economic side of the equation. So if he is successful of communicating that to undecided voters, he's going to win. Her change is exactly what you just talked about, which is, can we get past the insanity of Donald Trump? And what I thought was the biggest strategic error for her in this whole campaign, and it's not dissimilar, going back to Romney in 12, she wins the debate, right? And she wins the debate by going after Trump on his insanity. And instead of, kind of messaging on that track from then on, she goes and tries to talk about how great she is on the economy, which of course goes right back and plays into Donald Trump's hand. And so that was a massive strategic error for them. They should have been ready coming out of the debate to run that same message track. And that's the same thing that happened to Romney. Romney wins the last debate against against Obama, and he's doing really well, but his campaign just goes into some inane messaging that had no ability to kind of capture the lightning in the bottle.
Patrick, what is your view on that? And looking back now from October 14th, the Walls debate is October 1st. I can lay out a chart, I think, that's contiguously and continuously up and to the right from the moment that she gets into the race, really through the Walls debate. And it's always inevitable, right? There's always going to be a turn of possession in a presidential campaign. It's inevitable that there will be tough days. But if you were to look at the Harris campaign in its totality, the way that I would view it is that it really had a continuity until the Walls debate, and the momentum of the campaign is really, really interrupted, at the back end of that debate. Do you think that's a fair point?
I think that yes, I think that is a fair point, and the timing is right. I think the other thing that it's maybe less something that has happened and more something that fewer dramatic Trump blunders. Certainly it's not to say he hasn't said anything that, the three of us might consider to be off the rails, but we haven't had a moment like eating the pets. We haven't had a moment where Trump just made clear in a way that was widely consumed organically by people that this guy just is too out of control. He's focused on Hannibal Lecter. He's focused on all these other things. I think her ability to, I think the message about Trump being too erratic to lead has switched to being something that is a case Democrats have had to make explicitly, more so than something that people are seeing in TV news and in their media consumption naturally in the way that had been happening, I think for months prior. And that has made things harder for us. I think a lot of the levers Democrats have been pulling, it can feel like we've really hammered that point home and there's not much left to say. So I think Project 2025 is another example of this. It's become, we just haven't been able to keep up the momentum in the same way on those fronts. I don't think that means we can't win it back. And I agree with Greg that what she needs to do going forward and for the rest of the campaign is really remind folks of the type of leader Trump is, that he's too out of control, that he's too extreme, and connect that to an impact on people's daily lives and remind people that, when he was president, they didn't feel great. One of the things that we've seen really consistently in the Cook polling is that while Trump has had an advantage on issues like foreign policy and war, on issues like crime and violence, and on immigration, Harris has consistently held the lead on making you feel safer. Now, it's a very narrow lead, to be clear. It's not a big one whatsoever. But she has that lead in spite of the fact that she's behind on most policy fronts that people connect to safety. And the reason for that, I think, is very clear, which is that folks remember that they didn't feel safe when Trump was president, because you were always aware that at any point someone might set him off, he might go off the rails, maybe he's going to tweet something and start a nuclear war. So even if people do associate him with strength and the theoretical ability to, stop tumult in the world, they remember this guy's a little too crazy. This guy's a little too dangerous. And that needs to be the focus of her campaign in the final weeks.
So, Steve, let me pick up on something Patrick's talking about, because again, in the Cook political report stuff that we did, one of the best hits that she could use against him is this idea that he is going to have a day of reckoning for all of his political enemies. Right. And there has been a lot of that here in the last 24 hours. And, James Carville, who, of course, has the best political antennae out there, he comes out and says, I could be going to jail. They could be coming for me, all those types of things. And I think that, if her campaign was fleet of foot, they would be all over this right now because of all the kind of Nazi rally type discussion there's been around what Trump is saying, doing, et cetera. But they don't seem to be, that, adept. Just as a political practitioner, I think the most impressive part about the Trump campaign, this cycle, is when she became the nominee, he melted down. He went out of control. He said things that were, insane. He brings Corey Lewandowski into the campaign. And, Chris LaCivita and Miss Wiles, they sit there and they say, okay, we're going to control what we can control in the campaign. And they get the message going on her, on the economy and being too liberal. Same thing with on immigration. And they start that slow grind, the kind of Russian army grind on the center of the electorate to kind of make the race move in his direction. So they understood that their candidate was out of control, and they boxed him in and allowed, and tried to take him out of the play and really push the message from a TV advertising perspective.
I'm struck, Patrick, by something that you said that led into what Greg just talked about. So a complete agreement, right? The Hannibal Lecter, the Haitians are eating pets. There are these wild statements that are just impossible to look away from. Just full-on freak show level of rhetoric. You can evaluate it in a lot of different ways, I suppose. First time anyone ever heard him say it, the reaction, I suppose, that led the nations was Kamala Harris's on the debate stage. You laugh, but then you appreciate how exquisitely vicious and racist it is. And, the reality is it could have come out of the mouth of a Goebbels or a Stryker. And so here we are, 3 weeks before a presidential election in the United States of America. And the Republican nominee is talking about the enemy within, retribution, locking up political opponents. He's being specific. He's being direct. He's talking about deploying the army to snuff out dissent. And it just seems to me, in a two-party system, if you're the party opposed to this, which the Harris party is, and you look at on the day what Trump talked about. So what did he say today? And how would we rank it? And what's the high card, right, that he threw out today that we have to meet, we have to deal with, that we have to say something about? It would seem to me that there would be an urgent necessity on, say, the part of, let's say, President Clinton, right? If he was running against someone who did this, a President Obama, if he was running against someone who did this, a President Eisenhower or President Kennedy, if they were running against someone who said those things, there would be an urgency, a duty to warn, to speak to the country with the utmost seriousness about what's going on. And yet, it seems, when I open the page, I see this nice looking picture of the vice presidential ticket with spouses all dressed in blue, with Tim Walz's foot up in the air, right? Inexplicably, right? Like a happy, joyful picture. Campaigning on joy when the Republican nominee is campaigning on locking up political opponents and snuffing out dissent seems incongruent to me in the moment. It seems to be having the effect of decreasing intensity on the Democratic side at the moment when the danger is clearest, the rhetoric is the most obvious, and still we see this kind of opaqueness with dealing with it that I find right now, if you're looking at this through a polling prism, is very confusing to me.
Well, look, I certainly think that Trump has demonstrated that. I mean, he continues to say unacceptable things, and I think Harris's strongest points, or some of her strongest points, in this campaign, have been when she has been very clear, including during the debate. I also think this was the case during her DNC acceptance speech, where she was very clear that this man says unacceptable things, and this is not who we are. I think that her strength in this campaign lies in her ability to drive that contrast, and we certainly do see that panning out for her in our polling. We did have her leading slightly, driving her lead. Despite Trump being more trusted on a number of issues that are certainly important, like immigration and the economy overall. Voters were more likely to trust Harris to share their values. Voters were more likely to trust Harris to make them feel proud to be Americans. They were more likely to trust her and proud to be Americans and proud of their country. They were more likely to see her as someone who cares about people like them and will fight for their family specifically. So I absolutely agree that there have been there remain opportunities that Harris needs to seize to continue to drive that contrast. I think her strength in this campaign so far has come from her ability to do that in very compelling and effective ways at different moments in this campaign. And I think the question that remains is, can she continue to hammer home that contrast?
I want to ask you guys both a question, but I wanted to go with Patrick first. I want to role play here. I want to tell you exactly what I would say to the vice president right now if I'm on the campaign and we're in the room, right, where the 6, 7, 8 people who are going to decide the strategic direction of the campaign. And what I would say is, here's what the polling says. This is what the polling says. The polling says, for whatever reason, tragically, the American people look at him and her and evaluate him as stronger than her. They evaluate her as weaker than him. And there is no election that has ever been, ever in the history of America, where the person perceived as the weaker candidate beat the stronger candidate. It's never happened. There's no example that anyone can give. So you must be perceived as the stronger candidate. And there's just a reality here. Here's the reality. The reality is Joe Biden is not FDR. He's an unpopular president. In fact, he's almost as unpopular as George W. Bush was in the 2008 election. And the country overwhelmingly thinks it's on the wrong track. And the Democratic Party has been in an argument with the American voter for much of the last 2 years, telling them this is the choice. You get what you get. It's Biden or Trump. Belligerently so until the moment all of it falls apart. Harris gets in the race. There's a lot of people who say, well, this is shocking how she came up to the right, up and to the right on the arc, but it's explained exactly by the polling because there was such intensity with people not wanting the choice. And so when that choice went away, the enthusiasm abounds to her. But what people want to know is what she will do differently from Biden. The test at hand for her is she able, in the interest of the American public, to perhaps hurt Joe Biden's ego by telling the American people what the polling is demanding that she do: separate herself. So I think that if you're not strong enough to, over the last 4 years, be able to come up with a specific example, Afghanistan, the border, spending, and whatever it may be, nothing. There's not a thing that you would do differently. Nothing. It's an unacceptable answer because the American people think it's fear-based. It's fear-based. You're afraid to say something obvious for some hidden reason. And unless and until you cross that bridge, you're going to fall short on election day because you are underperforming where Biden was, and he won by 44,000 votes in 3 states. So you're on track to lose. And you guys sitting there as the pollster would say, what? Whoa, 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 whoa. He's full of shit. We got to kick him out, to he's right, to somewhere in between.
Yeah, I think it's somewhere in between. I think certainly, as we pointed out, her strength comes from being seen as an opportunity to turn the page not only on Trump, but on Trump and Biden, and to represent generational change. I think she has done a good job at using language like representing generational change to drive, to implicitly say, I'm a change from Biden, without staking out a position directly undermining the administration of which she is a member. So at the same time, I think one thing that is clear so far, when I look at our polling and look at other public pollsters polling results on who's trusted on issues versus who's trusted on different types of leadership qualities and temperament to be president and ability to lead this country, Trump tends to have the upper hand on most issues that are top tier issues for voters. There are certainly exceptions to that, abortion being the most obvious one. Although in basically every poll that's come out in this election, abortion is not the number one issue for voters, and certainly for undecided voters. So I think that there is some risk getting stuck in a conversation about which policy she would have done differently and why, and which approach she would have taken on which issue. I do think, though, she needs to be able to demonstrate that she would understand Americans' concerns in a different way, that she ultimately has a different vision for the future, maybe not a different vision for the past 4 years, but ultimately does, because she's younger, because she came up in a different era, because she would be a new type of leader. She has a different vision for the future. I think she's going to be better off if voters are focused on what the difference between her and Trump will be over the next 4 years, rather than what the differences between her and Biden might have been over the past four.
So, Steve, I mean, I think the first thing I would say in the room is speed kills. And, I think that the campaign is trying to do the generational piece right now with the health records, right? And it's clear that Donald Trump is making less and less sense on the stump as he's going through this process.
Do you think anyone cares about the health records?
I don't think it necessarily about the health records per se, but I think that the crowbar is the right one to employ. But what I would also say to you is you lay out a plan, and then you're presented with an opportunity, right? Which is this whole idea that we're going to round people up and the enemy from within. So what does the polling say? The polling says two things. Let's talk about two groups of voters. First is undecided voters. They are overwhelmingly independent. They think that Biden's done a terrible job on the economy. They're going to vote with Trump if it's a referendum on the Biden economy. At the same time, they think Trump is completely out of control, and they're going to vote with Harris if it's a referendum on his kind of, capacity to be a decent human being. Let's talk about a second group of people, and I find this group the most fascinating. And it's a small number, but there's, like you're saying, in a close race, all these small numbers matter. And that's the 1.5% who right now are saying they're going to vote for a third party candidate. And they are, in fact, economic voters who are voting for the third party candidate. And that's disproportionately coming out of Trump's hide. I think 57% of the folks who are voting for a third party candidate voted for Trump in 2020. And it's a working class, blue collar male. And male is really important because of the gender gap that's growing. And they agree with Trump on immigration, on the economy, but they've made a decision that they cannot support him because of how out of control he is. And so I would say to the campaign team, hey, we have these two groups that are both behaving the way we need them to behave, and we have this opportunity about the enemy from within. We need that right now. But of course, she's just had 10 days of really bad press because they also thought that she needed to do a lot of interviews, and that backfired on them. So they're going to sit there and say, we can't put her back out right now. And they need to, because they got to change the race.
Okay. Patrick, do you have something to say to that? And then I want to talk about those interviews for a second, since Greg brought them up.
No, I completely agree with Greg. She needs to get the focus back on Trump's leadership style. And that, again, is one reason why I don't think she wants to get stuck debating where she's different from Biden. She wants to keep this squarely focused on where she's different from Trump, while acknowledging that she would represent change from Biden, and that she would have a different approach over the next 4 years. But this needs to be about, this man is too out of control to deliver on any of the things that he might be promising to do. Just in terms of the polling on that front, one thing that I thought was, they're fielded at different times, but I was looking at the Wall Street Journal's most recent polling, which also asked, questions around issues and candidate preferences on different issue fronts. They found much wider margins in favor of Trump on some of the issues, particularly the economy, than we did in our poll. But I think one thing that stood out as a key difference is our poll asked who you trusted on these issues. The Wall Street Journal poll asked who did you think had a better ability on either of these fronts. And I think that that's a subtle but important distinction that really gets at one of the main dynamics of this race. Folks like a lot of the things Trump is promising to do. They even like much of his policy platform, even though I find it alarming and horrible. There's a lot there that voters believe that they like, but they're not actually sure they can trust him to deliver on any of those fronts. And the reason for that is because they know he gets distracted with his strange fixations. He goes off on people he perceives to be enemies. He's too erratic and out of control. And so again, I think that the way that she can undermine some of Trump's strength on economic issues, and particularly, with some of those, blue collar men that we're talking about, is by reminding people more and more that his erraticism, his craziness is going to prevent him from making a positive difference in your life. And I think that is more the angle to lean into than, he's too old or too unhealthy to be able to do this.
Greg?
Well, it's funny because I remember in 2008 and being alarmed because all of a sudden there was ads running in North Carolina where they had, Bull Connor using the fire hose on, black protesters in Alabama. And it's like, wow, that's really too far. But I think that Trump's behavior allows for really stark imagery right now that could advantage Harris if she was willing to do it, and if the campaign had the capacity to pivot quickly.
I'm Steve Schmidt. This is The Warning, and I invite you to subscribe on our Substack, on our YouTube channel. Follow us. Welcome to the community.